What are the Gypsies? Where do they come from? What is their culture like? Do they even have one? What language do they speak? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to another installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. Alright, so I owe this video to a frequent commenter and subscriber on this channel. I promised I will do this video and I do tend to actually keep my promises, even though when I promise a video it may take up to 6 weeks until I actually deliver, but I do deliver every single time. So before saying anything else, let's read the comment that triggered this video. The comment is from the Q&A section that I held over a month ago. So, Antonia Nicolai asks, I would like to learn about the Gypsies. What specifically made them a target for Hitler, their current place or situation in your region, if there is any integration by them into the greater societies they live in, especially in Eastern Europe, what is their rate of intermarriage outside their group, what are their prospects for the future? In Canadian language, when someone was shortchanged or swindled, the common expression used is that you were gypped. There is generally a disconnect from the origin of that expression. When trying to explain it to kids, it's challenging when the gypsy existence doesn't really make it on the radar in Canada, and I would assume the United States as well. Every time Cher comes on the radio, we get a little reminder to think of the gypsy caricature. The last century, Canadians of a Ukrainian background were often called Bohunks, a blend of Bohemian and Hungarian, because most people were pretty ignorant of the history with the musical empires game in Eastern Europe. I'm curious how the conflation of Roma Gypsies with the greater Romanian population impacts both groups. There was a viewer of yours that complained about prejudice in this regard, and I think it was related to being from Romania and being conflated with Roma Gypsies. Oh boy. I guess now everyone knows why I didn't respond to this so fast enough or so easily. There's quite a lot in there, so I'll try my best to respond. But before even engaging Antonia's questions, a lot of clarifications, historical mythology debunking, and a lot of other things are needed. So, for the purposes of this video, 3 segments are needed. Brief history of Gypsies, Gypsies in the modern era, and then the questions themselves. So, with that said, let's dive in. Segment 1. Brief history of Gypsies. Now, there is a lot of mythology going on from both the pro-Gypsy groups and the white liberals regarding the history of Gypsies. Such mythology survives, at least in part, thanks to the fact that Gypsies as a distinct group did not write down their history until very recently. Now, one such myth is that Gypsies are the descendants of the Dalits that ran away from oppression in India. The myth persists because it has, well, a grain of truth. It is true that most Gypsies of today do indeed trace their origins in modern-day India, particularly the Punjab area, known for its above-average share of Dalit population, but there is no evidence that their origins is necessarily to the Dalits, which are the untouchables in the Indian caste system. The confusion is further entertained by the fact that many Dalits, especially Dalit women in modern India, have a traditional clothing style that is remarkably similar to the Gypsies in Europe. Now, with that said, there are many groups that are now also known as Gypsies, particularly in Finland, southern Romania, northern Bulgaria, and eastern Serbia, which can definitely trace their roots rather to modern-day Mongolia. It's complicated. The arrival of Gypsies in Europe happened in stages. The first stage was in the 8th century when voluntary migration of people from modern-day West India occurred slowly. These populations settled for the most part in modern-day Russia, modern-day Ukraine, more specifically northern and eastern Ukraine, and also modern-day Georgia and Armenia. The second stage, which was also the largest, came with the Mongol invasion in mid-1200s, and when the Mongols withdrew in early 14th century, the gypsies that had come with them with the Mongols did not retreat, or at least most of them didn't. This particular stage brought gypsies in all areas of Central and Southeastern Europe, including modern-day Poland, Ukraine, Hungary, Czechia, Austria, and the Balkans. The third and final stage happened much slower in the 15th and the 16th century, also mostly via voluntary migration, and it is this particular stage that brought the gypsies in Spain and Finland. In Spain, they're known as Gitano, and in Finland as the Kale. Now, in spite of all these disparate waves and radically different routes of migration, for instance, the gypsies in Spain arrived there mostly through North Africa, as opposed to direct travel through Europe, as it's the case with the gypsies in Northern and Eastern Europe. But despite of all these, they have maintained a wide level of similarity with each other, and most of it survives till this day. Even though the Gypsy language has suffered multiple influences from various languages the Gypsies have encountered over the centuries and over their travels, the core of the language is still roughly the same. That's how it is possible for a Gypsy born and raised in, let's say, Bulgaria can have a conversation with a Gypsy born and raised in Finland, even though the Finnish Gypsy has no clue of Bulgarian and the Bulgarian Gypsy has no clue of the Finnish language. Now, with that said, the closeness between them is influenced also by the language of the country of birth. So, for instance, a Gypsy born and raised in Romania will have a much easier time getting along with a Gypsy born and raised in Italy than with one born and raised in Finland, precisely because the Gypsy dialect spoken in the Gypsy community in Romania had pretty much the same Latin influences that the Gypsy dialect spoken amongst the Gypsies in Italy had. Anyway, enough with this, let's get to the second part. So, segment 2, Gypsies in the modern era. Now, like most poor people in most of Europe, Gypsies entered the modern era either as slaves or as subjects to various discriminatory laws and or practices. Now, by 1850, slavery was abolished essentially everywhere in Europe, including for Gypsies, although most of Europe had abolished the practice even earlier, since the 1750s. So, for instance, in Finland, Gypsies were outlaws who could be hanged without trial, but the practice was discontinued in 1750 or 1748, depending on the source you trust. Nevertheless, the disdain for Gypsies did continue for many decades, and to a certain extent does survive to this day, even though most discriminatory policies have been abolished over a century ago, with the exception of World War II period, but I'll speak about that later in the video. Now, here's the part that nobody wants to hear. The disdain for Gypsies is not entirely unfounded. For instance, the Finnish Ministry of Justice indicated in 2005 that persons of Gypsy background, who make up less than 0.2% of the total population in Finland, perpetrated 18% of solved street robbery crimes in Finland. By way of comparison, the slightly larger 14,769 people, as opposed to the 10,000 Somali population, which were responsible for only 12%, while ethnic Finns were, of course, close to 51%. Same is true in Romania. Almost 50% of inmates are Gypsies, most of them for street robbery, theft, breach of trust, and other similar crimes. Very similar numbers can be observed in Hungary or in the Ukrainian provinces with a larger Gypsy minority, such as Zakarpatska Oblast. And the situation is not improved at all by the EU-sanctioned political correctness over the topic. For instance, the Wikipedia page on Finnish Gypsies contains a letter that could very well have been written about the Gypsies in any European country, which goes to show how similar Gypsies tend to be. The Wikipedia page says, quote, "In 2007, police officer and boxer Riku Lumberg of Romani heritage himself wrote an open letter to his own people seeking an end to the barbaric tradition of blood feud in the community. Roma artist Kiba Lumberg has said the following about the culture she grew up in. Blood food and the violence that exists in Roma culture can't be discussed in Finland. We can't accept that some groups hide behind culture to excuse stepping on human rights and freedom of speech. And the problem is that when a gypsy dares to speak in public about the negative things happening in their own tribe, they face death threats. If a white person opens their mouth, they're accused of racism, close quote. And this is not shocking at all, though I have to say that the gypsies in Romania seem to have found a way to solve the blood feuds without the blood part. Anyway, long story on that. Anyway, there is more to be said about, there's more to be said, but Antonia's comment does include enough questions to allow me to clarify those things. So, let's go to segment 3, the questions. So to do that, I'll partition this huge comment. First question, what specifically made them, that would be the gypsies, a target to Hitler? Well, they weren't white, they weren't seeking integration into the wider society, they tended to commit more crimes than the general population, and they were also amongst the least controllable group. Now the latter has particularly been the problem for essentially any totalitarian regime. Franco's regime had the same problem in Spain, although Franco's regime adopted the tactic of simply ignoring them altogether. The communist state in Eastern Europe tried to integrate them by force, but by late 1970s the communist state had essentially dropped the enforcement because the more they tried, the more the gypsies resisted. For instance, in Romania, there was a program to increase the literacy rate. The overwhelming majority of the illiterate population was Gypsy in 1960 when the program was launched. However, most of the graduates of the program were the very few non-Gypsies that attended the forced alphabetization classes. What I'm trying to say here is that resistance to any form of integration has always been a primary feature of a significant chunk of Gypsies. Also, as it relates to Hitler, Gypsies were also a bargaining chip. For instance, the Hitler-allied fascist regime of Ioan Antonescu in Romania faced severe backlash in the country when he tried to deport the Jews. So he essentially told Hitler, look, you're gonna have to leave me alone with that Jewish thingy, but look, I'll give you 20,000 Gypsies. Now it sounds cynical and awful when you put it this way, but that's basically how things went. A similar thing happened in Serbia as well. Now, one more thing that needs to be said is that in some cases the Nazi Reich did make distinctions between gypsies and individuals of gypsy heritage who integrated into the German society, at least in theory, because in practice government fails at everything regardless of its intentions, and the Nazi Reich is of no exception. The Holocaust Encyclopedia notes that, quote, in December 1942, Himmler ordered the deportation of all Roma from the so-called Greater German Reich. There were exceptions for certain categories, including people of pure gypsy blood dating from ancient times, persons of gypsy descent who were considered integrated into German society and therefore did not behave like gypsies, and persons and their families who had distinguished themselves in German military service. At least 5,000 and perhaps as many as 15,000 persons fell under these exemptions. Although local authorities often ignored the distinctions during roundups, police authorities even seized and deported Roma soldiers serving in the German armed forces in the Wehrmacht while they were home on leave. So yeah, that's basically why Hitler targeted them. Let's go to the next question. What is the gypsies' current place or situation in your region, if there is any integration by them into the greater societies they live in, especially in Eastern Europe? What is their rate of intermarriage outside their group, and what are their prospects for the future? Oh boy. Here I should probably mention the fact that the gypsies, although they speak essentially the same language, are divided into several subcultures, and that sometimes are quite radically different from each other, especially when looked upon from the outside. I mean, in the case of gypsies, not all gypsies are like that is really true, and this part is hard to explain because the English language doesn't even have the necessary vocabulary to explain that, but I'll try. Basically, the most integrated gypsy group is the Ursari. Now, this is the group that is now known among gypsies as the intellectuals, although their name derives from their previous occupation as animal trainers for circus purposes. However, when that trade lost its profitability, the Ursari were among the first gypsy tribe to settle down, establish property, have smaller families, and invest in education. Basically, they engaged in the civilization in which they happened to find themselves in. The crime rate among the Ursari is essentially zero, and many people of Ursari descent try to distance themselves from their gypsy heritage, going as far as to avoid teaching their children the gypsy language. The same is true for the Iron Men, I guess I could call them, or the Fierar, who were the first gypsy tribe to settle and integrate, and in the process it also lost its language. It's basically the only gypsy sub-tribe that really doesn't speak the gypsy language. This here is a map of Romania with the counties marked. On it there are the percentage of gypsies in each county that actually speaks the gypsy language. So as you can see, in the middle of the country, less than 20% of gypsies speak the gypsy language or the Romani language, going as low as 1% in the Brașov county, which is also the county with the highest number of gypsies that belong to the Iron Men tribe. The national average is 40%, and according to some pro-gypsy NGOs, it keeps on dropping, a claim which should be taken with a huge grain of salt, as these NGOs tend to lie quite a lot, so they can get more funding from gullible liberals. On the opposite end, there is the Modoran tribe. Now, this is a tribe that even the gypsy liberal intellectuals don't want to talk about, because no amount of political correctness has been able to curb the utter disdain that the rest of the gypsies have against the Modoran tribe. And that disdain only increased in the last 50 years, and it is due to the fact that most crimes attributed generally and committed by gypsies are in fact committed by this particular sub-tribe. And to make things worse, the Modoran tribe also tends to have the most numerous families. According to a local gypsy leader that I spoke with 2 years ago, roughly 60 to 65% of gypsies in Romania belong to the Modoran tribe, and roughly 95% of the crimes generally attributed to gypsies are in fact committed by the members of the Modoran tribe. So therein lies the problem. The largest gypsy subgroup is the least integrated one, and also the most prone to crime, including violent crime. Not even the harshest white racist speaks as bad about the Modorans as non-Modoran gypsies. The rest of the gypsies are, of course, very upset that they all get a bad rap because of this particularly large and particularly uncivilized group. Now, between these two extremes, there are at least 11 tribes with various degrees of integration. I guess it also depends on how you define integration. For instance, the tribe of the Flowermen, or the Florai, is a particularly wealthy tribe that distinguished itself in late 19th century, but although they're wealthy and have historically become wealthy mostly by manufacturing and selling nice decorations to the city bourgeoisie, so to speak, they're still not cured of old habits. So their houses tend to look like this, a very kitsch way of building, and although they can afford to build these luxuriant palaces, they still prefer to connect themselves and connect their palaces to electricity via illicit and illegal means. This is a problem in Bulgaria as well, as I discussed in a video almost 2 years ago. That video is called EU Court Minorities Must Get Free Electricity. Another issue that tends to be attributed to all gypsies, that is in fact tribe-specific, is the issue of blood feuds and child marriages. Now, most gypsy tribes went on with the times and slowly abandoned these practices, but at least 2 tribes did not. There will be the Silvermen, or the Argintari, called that way because they used to manufacture, well, silver objects. As you may have noticed, gypsy tribes tend to be named by their historical occupation or profession. Anyway, so the Silvermen and I don't know how to call them. Let's call them the Cauldron Men, or Calderai. These 2 did not abandon these practices to this very day. Now, Under the pressure of the authorities, but also from the rest of the gypsies, actual child marriages are now rare, but arranged marriages, long before the bride and the groom are old enough to even express an opinion, yeah, those are still a thing among some gypsies. On top of all these, there is the issue of continual refusal of integration. Again, except the Ursari and the Ironmen, which have already integrated, at least in Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, and Hungary, I don't have information about the subtribes in Spain or Germany, so make of that what you wish. But for the rest of the tribes, the vast majority of the gypsy population, the outright refusal to integrate is still very strong. And the situation is made even worse by the politically correct liberals who, instead of encouraging gypsies to integrate, they encourage them to preserve their customs. Anyway, it's a very long topic, but basically, no matter where you look in Europe, regardless of what policies were applied, the integration of gypsies is very, 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 very slow. I mean, Finland and Romania, for instance, had radically different policies on gypsies in the last 150 years, yet the result is nearly identical. This should show the gypsy activists and their white liberal allies that maybe, just maybe, the problem is not the wider society, but internal tribe issues within the gypsy community. Just saying. As for the prospects for the future, well, it really does depend to a large extent on who will lead the gypsy communities. For instance, on April the 13th, I went to a town close to my hometown to investigate allegations of institutional racism. Now, those of you who speak Romanian, you can watch the full investigation on my Romanian language channel. Basically, a local journalist wrote a very honest article about the problems that the gypsy community was creating for the rest of the town. The Bucharest Cathedral media, led by Vice, launched a crusade asking for the journalist to be fined for hate speech, and the mayor investigated. Now, of course, none of that actually happened because the journalist and the mayor were absolutely correct. So me and a friend of mine went down there to do proper investigative journalism. So we went to the peripheral gypsy ghetto and asked the gypsies about their position. Then we went to confront the allegedly racist journalist. Then we interviewed the mayor, and then we interviewed the local leader of the gypsies. Now, as it turns out, what Bucharest liberals were calling institutional racism, the local leader of the gypsies called an absolutely necessary correction on how things are being run. And he then went on to explain to his community that the mayor is right. What had happened is that the mayor had sent the police in their social housing. Now think of it like Section 8 housing, except the city owns the housing. So anyway, the mayor suspected that there are many people living illegally there without paying rent or even be registered with the city hall. And the mayor turned out to be correct. Anyway, long story short, if more gypsy communities end up being led by people who can make the distinction between racism and necessary enforcement of the law, things will get gradually better. If, however, the gypsy communities end up being led by militant progressives, things will at best stay the same, but more likely they will end up being far worse. It will also depend, though, at least in Romania, on the patience of the rest of the public. There aren't too many people that are happy with the current policies. I think I mentioned this before on this channel. Gypsies have reserved spots in the best universities, the best schools, the best anything, best primary schools, and in some counties the taxpayers can even be forced to pay for private education for gypsies. Now, 12 years into this policy, this has been around since 2005, 12 years into this policy, and the results are essentially nil. The schooling rate among gypsies did not increase, which leads me to suspect that this program is basically taken advantage of by wealthier gypsies, similar to what's happening with the Negro favoring affirmative action programs in the United States, where the wealthier Negro families benefit the most at the expense of the huge numbers of both Negro and white families that could legitimately be classified as underprivileged. The exact same thing is taking place here. For now, though, there isn't any prospect of mass support for abolishing these policies, but the discontent among the general population is rising. The only good news is that gypsies hate progressives even more than I do, so there is no immediate danger of antagonizing gypsies against the wider non-gypsy majority anytime soon. As for their rate of intermarriage outside their group, nobody has such data, as in nobody at all ever. Just by the look of the eye, though, it's not really that big. I mean, a Canadian friend of mine who permanently immigrated here in Romania was asking me when did the gypsies arrive in Romania, and I told him that it was around the 1250s. So he told me that, and this is a direct quote, "So you're telling me the gypsies have been here for almost 800 years and they still look Indian?" But yeah, overall, I don't think anyone has real data on the intermarriage rate because we never had policies that would forbid marriages between gypsies and non-gypsies, at least not nationwide. So yeah, all right. Sheesh, this is getting really long. All right, next part of the comment, quote, "In Canadian language, when someone was shortchanged or swindled, the common expression used is that you were gypped. There is generally discontent from the origin of that expression. I'm not surprised. When it comes to street merchants that routinely swindle or shortchange their customers, more likely than not, that merchant is a gypsy." So basically, while not all, perhaps not even most gypsies will swindle you, most of those that will do that will be gypsies. So I'm not surprised at all that gypped became a synonym for swindled. I mean, it sounds terrible when you put it this way, but as I always say, all stereotypes have a grain of truth in them. And the stereotype dies when the grain of truth disappears. And for this, I would give the example that my friend Jon Gunnarsson gave to me in one of our podcasts. At one moment, Polish was synonym with thief in Germany, because there was an unusually high amount of Polish people who would commit theft. Now, the stereotype essentially died entirely because this is no longer the case. Now, the stereotype of Polish people is that they're good plumbers. I would expect the same thing with gypped. When gypsies won't be overrepresented in theft, the stereotype will die. You know, I'm old enough to remember the time when nomad was synonym for gypsy. So stereotypes can actually change, but the first step needs to come from those who are being stereotyped. Anyway, let's move further. Quote, "When trying to explain it to kids, it's challenging when the gypsy existence doesn't really make it on the radar in Canada, and I would assume the United States as well. Every time Cher comes on the radio, we get the little reminder to think of the gypsy caricature." Now, I don't know much specifically about gypsies in the United States, but I'll tell you a story of a chap that I do know, a gypsy chap. He came from a Nursari family that sold their inherited properties and moved into a tiny apartment and gave the rest of the money to this chap so he can go and study in the United States, which he did. Then he got a paid internship with IBM. And at the interview, he was told, "Well, your name doesn't really sound Romanian. You don't happen to be a gypsy, are you?" He was frightened when he was asked this question, but nevertheless, he did admit to the interviewer that he was indeed a gypsy. To which the interviewer reacted to, "Oh, that's awesome! Can you do palm reading?" Actually, he had no idea what palm reading even is. I mean, he had seen it, but had no idea. But that was the stereotype that individual recruiter from IBM had about gypsies, that they're fortune tellers who do palm reading and other quasi-occult practices. In any event, there are at least 1.5 million gypsies in the United States, and they seem to follow very similar patterns to gypsies in Europe. The only difference is that the melting pot mentality seems to have been adopted a bit more there, so many gypsies in the US are essentially invisible. Now, the American progressives don't like that, but just like in Europe, their efforts to organize the gypsies as a militant group to divide the society even further continuously fail, because gypsies, by culture, seem to be immune to progressivism. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't individual progressive gypsies, but as a group, no luck. Now, why is that the case? Why gypsies seem to be so immune to progressivism, as a general rule? Now, that is a subject for another video, which I may or may not do. It depends. If someone gives a shekel for that, maybe I will. And yes, of course, I'll gyp you for that. Anyway, let's go further. Quote, in the last century, Canadians of a Ukrainian background were often called bohunks, a blend of Bohemian and Hungarian, because most people were pretty ignorant of the history with the musical empires game in Eastern Europe. Yes, and I don't blame them. The gypsy music, for better or worse, is one of the most diverse genres in existence. Classical music and metal are the only ones that are even more diverse than gypsy music. I mean, think about it. Flamenco is essentially gypsy music. It is. I'm not joking. So is Argentinian tango, which is in fact coming from southern Spain, and it is gypsy music. Southern Spain has traditionally been gypsy dominated in the culture department. Also, most of the traditional or folklore music in most of Central and Eastern Europe, at least has gypsy influences, if it is not outright gypsy music. Not to mention some subgenres, more generally known as Oriental music, are in fact gypsy music. The same goes with some of the classics of Russian music, which were in fact songs composed by Russian gypsies, which then seeped into the mainstream culture. So yeah, I don't blame the Canadians for being unaware of all these things. It's an immensely complicated network of topics, and a topic that will, while it may be indeed interesting, it is not a life-needed skill. I mean, the only reason I know about many of these things is because almost 2 decades ago I made part of my living as a cameraman for weddings, and a significant minority of my clients were gypsies. So that's how I learned about some of these things. And I would argue that it is the best way of learning these things, because there aren't many particularly good books on the topic. Alright, last portion of the comment. I'm curious how the conflation of Roma gypsies with the greater Romanian population impacts both groups. There was a viewer of yours that complained about prejudice in this regard, and I think it was, this is an issue indeed, and it's a very long debate over it. On one hand, gypsy activists claim that they have been using the term Roma to refer to themselves since at least the 1930s, and that it's been a widely accepted term at least since the 19th century. Now, it is true that Roma was used by some gypsies to refer to their ethnic group at least since the 1930s, but it is definitely not true that it's been a widely accepted term since the 19th century. For instance, in 1937, there were 2 newspapers in circulation in what we now call the Greater Romanian Kingdom, dedicated to gypsies and edited entirely by gypsy intellectuals and journalists. One of them did indeed, in fact, refer to gypsies as Roma or Romi, and the other referred to them as Țigani. In fact, the word gypsy is an anomaly in European languages. English is an anomaly in this regard. The common story is that the first Englishmen who saw gypsies mistakenly assumed that they were Egyptian. The word for gypsy is țigan, or some variation of that. Țingaro in Italian, țigan in Russian, țiganiok in Hungarian, țigan in Romanian, țigăiner in Norwegian, Țigăine in German, Gitano in Spanish, and so on and so forth. So for the overwhelming majority of history, for the overwhelming majority of European languages, the word for this minority is some variation of țigan. So you say țigan anywhere in continental Europe and everyone knows exactly what you're talking about. However, various progressive activists, most of them not gypsies themselves, have managed to convince Brussels to use Roma instead, but for the most part the word did not catch, well, pretty much anywhere, not even amongst most gypsies. Basically, the word Roma was a way for progressives to be pedantic pricks at best, or idiots at worst. In essence, Roma is not a phraseology widely used by gypsies, It's not a phraseology widely used by non-gypsies either. It's just a phraseology used by bureaucrats, politically correct cucks, and other human vermin of similar kind. But yes, the adoption of this phraseology by various bureaucracies did lead to a confusion abroad between gypsies and the wider Romanian population, and it is of course annoying, not just because the negative stereotypes of gypsies are applied to the wider Romanian population, but also because it sometimes leads to very weird situations. For instance, roughly 2 years ago, I think, or maybe 3, a young Romanian couple who was visiting Stockholm lost their papers 2 days before their scheduled return flight. So they went into the city hall to ask for directions for the Romanian embassy so they can get another set of papers in an emergency regime. But because either their English or the employees' English was crap, I don't know, basically they couldn't make themselves understood on what exactly they wanted. So the city hall employees asked them what is their native tongue, because they might actually have a translator. So they said their native tongue is Romanian. But the city hall employees brought a translator from the Gypsy language, called in politically correct circles Romani. Hilarity followed because the Gypsy translator didn't speak English either, so basically the translator made things worse. So yeah, the confusion is a real issue and it pisses off quite a lot of people. I personally don't exactly care. I mean, I've been called a lot worse things in life than a gypsy, so I can't really be bothered to care that much. But I do understand those who are pissed off about this confusion. Also, it's not just Romanians who are affected. The inhabitants of Rome, Italy, are also affected, because basically, if you want to refer to in Italian to gypsies whilst being politically correct, you have to call them Roma, which is the exact same spelling and pronunciation to the city of Rome, or Romani, which can mean at the same time people of Rome, gypsies, and Romans, as in the Roman Empire. So yeah, this particular term may be politically correct, but it's very impractical and ultimately doomed to fail. I mean, even the most PC organizations have resorted to writing Roma people and then write gypsies between parentheses, because there aren't really enough people willing to use the term, and a significant number of people who've never heard of this term, and for bloody good reason. The argument for this term is basically that Roma is their endonym, or the name given by the gypsies for gypsies, whereas gypsy or țigan is the exonym, or the name given by non-gypsies to gypsies. Even if that were true, and again, it's not really a clear-cut issue as many would have you believe, it's still not a good argument. After all, the Japanese call themselves Nippons, but I've never seen any militant movement to try to get Europeans to stop calling Japanese people, well, Japanese, and force the endonym Nippons. Same with the Greeks. They call themselves Hellenians, and the name of Greece in Greek, in the Greek language, is Ellada. Yet I haven't seen any Greeks calling everyone else xenophobes for referring to Greeks as, well, Greeks instead of Hellenians. Anyway, I hope this answers the set of questions and also explains why it took me that long to approach this topic. I barely scratched the surface in this video, really. For instance, I didn't say anything about the Gabori, which are Hungarian-speaking gypsies that are actually not Hungarian, but they're not Romanian either, yet they have good craftsmanship and funny hats, in addition to carrying a very weird underclass that is also sometimes violent. I also didn't get into the specifics of the gypsy language, which is a fascinating subtopic in and of itself that's starting to slowly be studied academically, although there are still disputes. For instance, the biggest dispute now is which writing system is appropriate. The widely accepted one is based on the Latin language developed by a gypsy academic born in Romania, but then there is another script that some Hungarian gypsies tried to adopt, but that is based on the Turkish language, which most gypsy intellectuals say it's inappropriate because it doesn't respect the Indo-Aryan origin of the gypsy language. So as I was saying, it's a monumental topic that I know quite a lot about, even though it's quite far from the top 100 most relevant topics to myself. So yeah, With all of that being said, thank you for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous support. And I guess I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.